How would Utah football have done in the 2022, 2021, and 2019 college football playoff if those formats had been expanded to 12 teams? We're talking about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. If this is your first time listening to our show, make sure you guys like and subscribe. We'd love to interact with you guys in the comments on YouTube or on social media. You can follow our show at Locked On Utes or my personal handle at JT Wistrcill. On today's show, we're going to be diving into and talking about how Utah would have performed if the 12-team playoff format had been in place for the past few seasons, which would have, of course, placed Utah in the playoff. And in order to help us do that, it's friend of the show and UteZone contributor, Dante Guardi. And Dante, let's start with 2022 with Utah. And this idea comes to us courtesy of Ross Dellinger, who did tweet out, formerly of Sports Illustrated. Ross Dellinger will be on his feet, I'm sure, very soon, had put out the list that was sent to, and basically the college football had distributed to the media. It's last year's rankings plugged into the 2024 expanded field, which is, as we said, will be arriving 24. This will be the final year. The 23 season will be of the current 4-team format. So in this format, Utah would have been awarded the 4th seed overall. Utah earned that over Kansas State, I believe, because they were ranked slightly higher in the college football rankings when the final one came out. But either way, Utah earns the 4th ranking. And because of that, they take on the winner of Tulane and TCU. Those of you who are listening to this might be surprised that TCU was the 5, but don't forget they did lose to Kansas State for their first loss of the season. So I expect TCU to beat Tulane, and I think Utah TCU would be a great game, Dante. I mean, TCU played so many close, great games last season. It was kind of their hallmark. That was just kind of what they did. I mean, you look at nail-biting wins over teams like Kansas early on, over Oklahoma State. They beat Kansas State in their first go-around. The Texas Tech win, the Texas win, the Baylor win. I mean, so many close games. I think this one would have been a fantastic game. As much as it pains me to say, just because I got to be honest, I felt like TCU had that magic last season. I think they would have found a way to beat Utah in a late close contest. I definitely could see a world where Utah would have won this one, but I do think that TCU would have found a way to knock off Utah in a very competitive 5-4 matchup if this was how the college football playoff played out last season. But how do you feel about this matchup?
Yeah, so that TCU team, I was pretty low on them heading into the year. Obviously,
Everyone was. It was Sonny Dyk's first season.
Yeah, it was kind of a swing and a miss on my part. But, I mean, you just take a look at the roster and take a look at how their games actually went. And it's clear to see that this team wasn't really as good as their record was, in my opinion. I don't think their defense was overly impressive. Obviously, they had LT's nephew, or I don't know what exactly he was, but he was the Thorpe Award winner, the cornerback, Hodges Tomlinson. He was a fantastic player, obviously. Max Duggan had the offense firing on all cylinders. He had a rocket of an arm. But, I mean, overall, I just didn't think that team was going to be able to hold their own in the college football playoff, and they ended up drawing Michigan. I thought they were going to get blown out. Michigan throws 2 interceptions, 2 pick sixes, and they don't win that game, even though they scored 45 points. But then I think that kind of comes back to, like, if Utah were to play TCU, you look at Michigan's team. It was J.J. McCarthy in his first career playoff game, first year as a starter, still a young player. The lights were just simply too bright for him in that game, I think, and that was what attributed to a lot of his struggles. But then you look at Utah's roster. It's Cam Rising, who had been a starter already for a couple of seasons. You know, a guy who's probably not going to be turning the ball over like that in a big game. I mean, he's an experienced player, a guy who's won Utah a plethora of big games. I think Cam Rising wouldn't have thrown 2 pick sixes if he was in that game. And I think that Utah would have won that game, honestly. I really do, because I think you got Clark Phillips on the outside. Obviously, Quentin Johnson is a lot bigger than Clark is, but I think that in terms of being able to just stick with him, Clark would do a pretty good job. And then I think Utah would be able to do some things with the other players in the secondary, whether it's Cole Bishop or Sione Vaki, maybe to double up Quentin Johnston and hope that he doesn't have a huge game, because outside of him, I mean, they had Darius Davis and they had another speedy receiver, but they weren't like total game breakers. It was more of like when the defenses were keying in on Quentin Johnston, these other 2 guys would have a monster play off of a play action, and it was just a busted coverage or something like that. I don't see Utah doing that. I think Utah's defense last season was a lot more mature, especially down the stretch, than a lot of the Big 12 defenses that TCU was going up against. You said TCU Utah. I'm not even sure TCU beats Tulane. That Tulane offense.
Oh,
That
okay.
offense was extremely innovative. They beat USC in the bowl game at the end. I mean, I respected the USC team a lot more than I respected the TCU team. So I'm not entirely sure how the Tulane TCU game would have gotten, but it would not have shocked me if Tulane had pulled that upset. But regardless, I think Utah would have beat both those teams pretty easily.
Okay. I get what you're saying. I do think there's something to be said for a TCU team that does continue to find those ways to win, as they did against a Michigan team last year. And the one thing I will give like a Michigan the edge on, because as you mentioned, Utah definitely had the quarterback advantage there. Cam's not throwing those pick sixes. That's a great point. I don't think he would. And as you mentioned with Clark, his ability to consistently battle with those receivers who were a little bit bigger than him, I think he holds up. I do think that Michigan team was a little.
You look at when he went up against Drake London in 21 in the Coliseum. I mean, he held his own. I think he had 3 pass breakups in that game. And Drake London, I think, is quicker than Quentin Johnston is. I mean, Absolutely. I don't know exactly how much bigger or smaller he is than him, but he's definitely quicker than him. So I mean, I think Clark would be able to hold his own against him, especially if they gave him some extra help on those deep passes, like on those long passes where he just simply couldn't go up against the guy who's 7 inches taller than him, 7 inches taller than him.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The one thing that obviously Utah doesn't have, just compared to a Michigan, is Michigan's talent in the trenches is a little bit stronger, but it's not like Utah's bad in the trenches. They got really good offensive linemen, got good defensive linemen too, especially the defensive tackles for Utah last year. I think it would have been a great game, to your point. Like I said, my biggest thing is just that TCU team always continued to find a way. Duggan made plays, even though I do like Cam Rising a little bit better than a Max Duggan, but I got to give Max Duggan credit for always finding that way to win overall. So we're both in agreement. I think it would have been a great game. As you said, you think Utah would be able to roll either way. But unfortunately, no matter who won that game between Utah and TCU, their season would have come to an end from there, unfortunately, Dante, because they would have met up with Georgia. And Georgia was clearly the best team last season. I think Utah would have put up a better fight than TCU did, although I think most TCU fans thought they were going to put up a better fight too. So you never really know how that one was going to turn out. But I do feel like Georgia would be able to advance pretty easily over Utah. And I don't think they'd beat them by over 50, whatever it was last year, but they would probably still get a nice handed 20-30 win more than likely, just because that Georgia team was that dominant.
Yeah, probably I'd say 49-21 or something like that. But yeah. I'm not sure exactly how many touchdowns TCU scored in that game. Probably 2. I think Utah would have scored 3 touchdowns against Georgia. I think Utah's offense is much more methodical, much more precise, whereas TCU is much more boom or bust, which is not what your game plan should be when going up against the Georgia Bulldogs. So I think Utah's methodically kind of centered offense would have done a little bit better, but obviously Georgia was far and away the best team in college football, so it would not have been much of a game now.
Yeah, but it still is exciting to think about what could have been for this Utah team if the playoff was expanded. Obviously, the opportunity to get a win, which we both think they would be able to do against the TCU or Tulane if they would have matched up with them, is really exciting. And that's what's exciting about the future of college football, is that we are getting this expanded format in general. And had it been in place, Utah would have made the college football playoff 3 of the last 4 years, with that only year and day I haven't made it had been the COVID season, which we've already basically thrown out anyways overall. So it is very interesting to see what would happen if Utah took on that TCU team last season. And it's also interesting to look back and see what Utah would have done in 2021. We're going to talk about that in a second, as Utah would have taken on Notre Dame and Cincinnati potentially. We'll talk about how that would have played out in a moment. But first, I want to talk to you guys about our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Take your first swing at betting on MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. All that's on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. All caps, no spaces, locked on. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Dante coming back into this one. Let's take a look then at the 2021 season for Utah. Obviously a magical year for the Utes, and the crazy run they had was just incredible. I mean, when you start going 1-2 in your season overall and then come together to close out the season 10-4 in total. Yeah, the one loss to Oregon State and the final loss in the Rose Bowl to Ohio State. This was a special Utah team, and they were clicking. They were playing their best ball towards the end of the season. That Oregon loss, I want to say, occurred sometime in I think it was October when that Oregon State loss hit them. And then after that, the only loss they had was to a CJ Stroud and a Jackson Smith and Jigba, who both just heard their names called in the first round of the NFL draft not too long ago. So, and Utah was well in that game and very much could have had an opportunity to win it too. So that was a special Utah team when you talk about Cam Rising emergence and the best version of Tavion Thomas, Devin Lloyd leading a defense as well, with Minka Tafua really coming on strong for the pass rush too. I think this is a Utah team that not many teams would have wanted to face. Utah would have been the 11th seeded team, and they would have taken on Notre Dame that year. And that Notre Dame team, that was Ian Book, Chase Claypool, as well as, oh, I'm mad at myself. I looked up the tight end's name, and I'm totally blanking at it right now.
Michael Mayer.
I thought it was the guy before Michael Mayer. But you might be right. I thought that there was one other guy. But either way, a lot of talent on the Irish that they always have. But as I look at this matchup, and like I said, I mean, this is a really good Notre Dame team still. But they did lose some games. They lost to Georgia that season. Georgia highly ranked. They lost to Michigan as well. But a lot of their wins I look at, they had two wins versus a ranked team. One of those was against Navy. So I discount that a little bit. No offense, Navy. They also beat Virginia. But I just look at the way this Utah offense and defense was clicking, and I believe they actually do beat Notre Dame that year. I think if you look at how this Utah team was performing, as I mentioned, I felt like they were a team poised for a magical run if this was an NCAA March Madness type tournament. And I think Utah would have been able to knock off the Fighting Irish in advance, Dante.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting matchup. I think that this would have been a little bit of a better matchup than like if 22 Utah were to play 22 TCU. Like I think both these teams were very solid. And then for me though, the big thing is that you look at why Utah lost that Rose Bowl game. It's like, well, Mekhi Bernard was playing corner, and it's regardless of who the opponent was, like he would still have to go out there and do that. The secondary was still completely decimated. Zemiah Vaughn, Fabian Marks, like the entire room outside of Clark Phillips was gone, And then you look at a team like Notre Dame where, yeah, Jack Cohn was their quarterback. He's not going to blow you away. But their rushing attack was more than serviceable. Their offensive line, Notre Dame's offensive line is always going to be up there with the best. So I think Notre Dame had a path to points there. I think they'd be able to run the ball and keep Utah's defense on their heels a little bit and be able to find open receivers because that's what Ohio State did. And obviously a lot of difference in talent, but like I think almost any team in the nation probably would have been able to throw on Utah on that day just because of how bad and how decimated the secondary was. So at that point, it's like the throw game is going to be there, and Notre Dame is going to run the ball on you. So I think they had a lot of opportunity for points on offense. But then you look at the Utah offense, it's like they were scoring points a ton as well. And then you look at the special teams as well; they were firing on all cylinders there too. So I think that this game would have been like not a shootout, but like both teams were going to have long drives and they were going to be scoring points at a decent rate. So, I mean, I would say Utah would probably win that game like 34-31, something along those lines, because I do think that Utah offense was really explosive. That was when Brant Keithy was completely healthy. That was when Brandon Covey was still on the team. So, I mean, a lot of weapons to work with there. And you still have the rushing attack with Cam Rising with his legs and and Tavion was on his game too then. So, I mean, you have a lot of offensive players who are just going to blow you away. And Notre Dame wasn't like, they were certainly not unbeatable that year, but I do think it would have been a very close game because Utah's secondary was completely decimated, and I do see a lot of points being scored by the Irish, but I just see more being scored by the Utes. Really close game, but like I said, Utah wins by like a field goal.
Yeah, and the one thing too, you just make a great point mentioning is like because that secondary is decimated, Ian Book, Chase Claypool, and the name I was looking for just a little bit ago was finally able to figure out was Cole Kmet is also part of that passing attack too. You get Jeremiah Osu Koromoa as a good pass rusher. Kyle Hamilton's on the back end, so that would be a really good game. We both have Utah squeezing that one out, but I agree it would be a good game. And the next one that Utah plays would be a very interesting game as well to me, because after that you would have Utah taking on Cincinnati, and I think that's a Cincinnati team. Desmond Ridder, Sauce Gardner, the Cincinnati team that did some positive things, but look, was obviously overmatched in the college football playoff that year when they got matched up with an Alabama team there too. So I do wonder if Desmond Ridder would be able to take advantage of kind of those same things that, as you just mentioned, Ian Book would have a little more success to me, because I just felt like Ian Book was a little bit more of a polished passer at that point, although Desmond Ridder can do some positive things with his legs too. And look, those were really good Cincinnati teams under Luke Fickell. We just mentioned the guy like Sauce Gardner, who's come in the NFL and dominated right away, right? So I feel like this would have been a good battle, but man, Spencer, I don't know. Once again, I think Utah could have found a way to win this one. This is a Cincinnati team, as we mentioned, like just look at their strength of schedule and everything as well. I'm not trying to discount them as a group of 5 team, but I just think Utah would have posed a lot of problems when they were clicking at this point in the season, especially Tavion Thomas. I just think they would have a really hard time containing him.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure how the 21 Utah offensive line fared in size compared to the now ones or the previous ones. But like just thinking of the names on that offensive line, like there were some big boys. Bam Olaseni, obviously
Braden
6'8".
Daniels,
That's a unit of a
X
man.
Ford.
Talalomea and Braden Daniels were both in the early stages of their career, but they were both very good run blockers even then. Nick Ford was a great leader. So, I mean, that was a really good offensive line. And you look at that game that Cincinnati lost that year, I'm pretty sure it was to Bama, the
Yeah, it was.
team that in the real playoff game. And my main takeaway from that game was just like Cincinnati couldn't compete in the trenches against Alabama. And I think there's a pretty significant difference between Utah and Alabama, but like that was one of Utah's best offensive line units. That was one of their biggest offensive line units. I think Utah would have been able to run the ball, I mean, pretty much at will in that game, and therefore opening the passing attack. And then you look at the guys that were making real contributions on Utah's like at the skill positions when it comes to the pass catchers. I mean, these guys weren't being lined up against Sauce Gardner in the first place. Like Brant Keithy's not being lined up against Sauce Gardner. Sauce Gardner's not playing in the slot against Britton Covey. Those are your two best offensive players when it comes to receiving the football, and they're far away from the best defensive players on Cincinnati. I think Utah would have won this game by 2 touchdowns, honestly, maybe even more. I know Alabama only won that game by 17, the one that they actually did beat Cincinnati in, but like that game was far from over in like the second quarter. It was just boring. The second half was, and Bama had that game won within the first like 12, 15 minutes. So, I mean, I think Utah would have taken a little bit longer to solidify a win, but I mean, I do think that Utah would have won that game pretty easily.
Yeah, at that point, then Utah, after beating both Cincinnati and Notre Dame, that would eventually lead to them matching up against a Michigan team with Cade McNamara at quarterback. The pass rush is the thing I think I look at this matchup that worries me a little bit because I like Bam Olsen, he's mentioned. I like Braden Daniels, but they'd be going against what I believe that year was the best pass rushing tandem in college football. They had the best pass rusher, Nate Hutchinson, and David Ojabo, I believe is his name, was also phenomenal on the other side as well. So this at Michigan, look, that was a year as well. They won the Jim Moorhead Award. They have an outstanding offensive line. I would probably have Utah's run coming to an end here, just predicting it. I think this Michigan team is really good. But look, it's also one of those things. Hey, Cam Rising, I think this would be another fantastic game. I just think that in the end, I think some of that talent for Michigan, and I really think an Aiden Hutchinson would have had himself a game as good as Bam Olaseni was. And look, Utah did a good job holding in check the Kayvon Thibodeau's of the world, but I felt like Aiden Hutchinson, Thibodeau did have a little bit of a down year his final year versus, as we said with Hutchinson, he was the best rusher in college football overall. I think this Michigan team might have found a way, but I wouldn't fall back in my chair if Utah found a way to win this one either. Dante, how do you see it playing out?
Yeah, I mean, you look at those two pass rushers, Ojabo and Hutchinson, both first round picks. And I mean, I've voiced my approval for that 21 Utah offensive line, but this is just another level.
Yes.
It's simply another level. And I think that Utah would have been able to hang tough for the first couple of quarters and really make it a game. But then at that point, it's just like they just get grinded out, too tired. Blake Corum breaks off a huge run, and Michigan just as Michigan. They end up winning the game like, I don't know, I'd say probably 35-21, 35-24, something along those lines. But I think Utah hangs in there, but Michigan's just too tough, too unflappable, I guess would be the word, just because it's so hard to grind them down. And I think it would, if anything, it would be the opposite. And I think there would be some times where it'd be like Utah would kind of look at a moment and be like, we got to make a play here. And then that would end up just like they try, I don't know, that somebody like overruns a play and then it just ends there, something like that. It happens pretty often. And I think Michigan was just too good of a team that year.
And to your point, even if Utah found a way to get in another upset, what awaits them on the other side was Alabama and Georgia. And that's with those two quarterbacks, Stetson Bennett and Bryce Young, they would have really taken advantage of the secondary deficiencies of this Utah passing attack, even more so than a Cade McNamara would per se as well. But it is still interesting to look back and see, like, man, this Utah team had a chance. If that was the expanded playoff format, I just don't think many teams would have wanted to see this Utah team. And I could see Britton Covey. That's the one factor in all these games, right? Breaking off that big return that completely changes the complexion of a game. That's something that can't be quantified for. So it would have been cool to see what Utah could have done that year. And another year for Utah that was really successful, obviously, was 2019. They were outstanding that season. Had they beaten Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game, they would have gone to the college football playoff that season. But unfortunately, they did not. They fell to Oregon. It was when Julian Blackman got hurt at that point. It was just a really unfortunate the way everything ended up shaking out for this Utah team. But in this expanded college football format, they would get a shot in the playoff. They would be the 11th seed. Unfortunately, they would take on Oregon again. This would be a little different to me than like how Utah got absolutely steamrolled by Texas, because given that this is an opportunity to play in the college football playoff, I do think Jalen Johnson would have played in this game rather than opting out. So I think that gives Utah a little bit of a boost. Based on the injury, I don't think Julian Blackman would have been able to make it back though. So Utah still probably gets gets beat up pretty good by Oregon in this one, who was just a superior team, good defensive line, Justin Herbert rolling, Penei Sewell up front too. I think it would have been a similar fashion how the first game played out. I just think this Oregon team was better than this 2019 Utah team.
Heavy disagree.
Really?
I think the 19 team was better than the 21 and 22 team. If they replayed that season, there's little hesitation in my mind that team isn't running the table and going to the college football playoff, because they were the fourth best team in football that year. I will die on that hill forever. And that college football, that game, that essentially a playing game to get into the college football playoff, Utah was favored by 7 points. I mean, everyone had Utah. Utah was the better team. It was known. Kayvon Thibodeau blocks a punt. A lot of weird stuff happened in that game.
Thibodeau was nuts, to your point. He was unbelievable. They would have been a better plan for Thibodeau second time.
Yeah, like I think if they reran that game, Kayvon Thibodeau is not blocking 2 punts. A lot of the things that happened, a lot of those like 50-50 plays wouldn't have gone Oregon's way. And then you take all those things into account. I mean, Utah was still within a touchdown in the third quarter. They were down 23-0 at a point, came back, scored 2 touchdowns, were within 8, and got the ball back. They had a chance to tie the game in the second half, and then it didn't go their way. CJ Verdell breaks off a massive run, some missed tackles there, and the scoreboard looks a lot more lopsided than the game actually was. But like I said, I mean, that Utah team was steamrolling everyone, absolutely everyone. None of these games were even close. That defense was loaded. Bradley and I mean, they had Jalen Johnson as well. They had literally so many athletic freaks, so many just game breakers at all levels of the field, offense, defense, special teams. Even Damari Simpkins returned a punt against Colorado on senior day. That was really cool. That team was awesome. That team downright was my favorite Utah football team ever. Might be a little bit biased, but I really do think if they rerun that season, that team doesn't lose a game, because the USC game too, that was another game. When they lost to USC, that was a fluke as well. Utah, if you look at the box score, Utah was the better team in every single component of that game. Just it wasn't their night. It wasn't their night. And then now it's like, yeah, like I said, if they were to replay that season, Utah goes undefeated because they were the better team against both the teams they lost to. They obviously Oregon outplayed Utah on the night of the conference championship game, but the USC won. Utah was the better team that night. It was just an unlucky result. But as for the rest of the games, I mean, they annihilated pretty much everyone. BYU, they annihilated week 1, and BYU got lucky too. They didn't lose that game by like 40, because Utah could have scored another touchdown as the time was dwindling down. But Coach Wood decided to be nice to them and didn't rain it on. But I mean, there were just so many games where Utah was just by far the better team. They were the best team in the Pac-12 that year. And they should, honestly, if they replay that game, like I said, I think they win it against Oregon and they make the college football playoff. Probably wouldn't have beat whoever it was the number 1 that year, but I mean, that team was extremely good. You know, Julian Blackman, Jalen Johnson, Bradley and young Mika Tafua. There were just so many aspects of that team to love. Lecky Fotu as well. That entire defense was electric. And then obviously Tyler Huntley as well, leading the way at quarterback, smart, athletic quarterback leading the way. You got your high school buddies there as well. The chemistry, the storyline, everything about that team was simply perfect. And it's still unfortunate that they weren't able to really make anything too crazy out of it. Obviously, not getting a New Year's Six after that loss was unfortunate, but I do think that they would have beaten Oregon if they got to play again.
There's definitely a chance. I think I'd feel better about it if a Julian Blackman was back, because I do remember early on in that game, Utah's defense looked strong, and Julian was just such an essential part of this defense too overall. But to your point, they were really dominant that season. The one thing I will say is that was a little bit of a down year for the Pac-12. Just looking at Utah's schedule, they did not play a ranked team outside of Arizona State before they met Oregon in the championship game that season. And Washington was okay.
The talent in the conference was still up there, though. Like
Washington, but it's not what
terrible. Like
I don't know what it is. It's not what it is now, though.
No, not even close.
Washington.
Not even close.
But you're right. It's not like it was a terrible year for the conference. It just wasn't as good as it is right now too. So I definitely see your point. It is just, look, the game was still 37-15, that last Oregon game, but you did mention there were key moments in the game that if you run it back again could be a little different. But Justin Herbert was dealing at that point too. But I can definitely see a world what you're talking about comes to fruition, where this Utah team does keep it going. The one thing that still gives me a smile when I click on the 2019 box scores of the season is the 49-3 game against UCLA. Yeah, where the Utah defense just blitzed DTR. I mean, it was just a domination for us. Or the Jaden, 21-7, 21-3. That was the one team. They did play that Arizona State team.
That's what I'm saying. Like, you don't see players like having those sort of stat lines unless these teams are really that much better than them. Like that Jaden Daniels stat line, I think it was like 4 for 21, 18 yards, something along those lines. Like that's really, really bad. Like that. I don't know. I don't care if you're a freshman. Like if you're starting at the Power 5 level and you're having a game with that sort of stat line, like that is unacceptable. Like that says way more about the defense you're going up against. Like that team was so loaded.
They were loaded. And yeah, like I said, it's just, I think they would have lost Oregon again, but to your point, they deserved a rematch. And there were a lot of things in that game that could have played out very differently. So it would have been interesting to see how it played out. And look, it's going to be interesting to see with this coming fall, what this Utah team's able to do. They have the talent to be a team that can compete for the CFP. Unfortunately, their schedule is going to make that extremely difficult. And I would be very surprised if they were only make it through the regular season and be a one-loss conference champion with how many difficult games they have. But hey, as Kevin Garnett said, anything is possible, right? So we'll see how it all plays out this fall. Dante, appreciate you joining us. And as we inch close to the season, where should people head over to for more Utah football content?
UteZone.com. I'm gonna have some reports on about some of the other Pac-12 teams up soon. I've finished them and they're actually already published. I have like a Wix site that I'm just like publishing like
Nice.
a breakdown for every single Power 5 team. So I'm just gonna relay those the Pac-12 ones onto UteZone because it's all good information. All the articles are pretty in depth about all the teams that Utah shares a conference with for the next season. Obviously, UCLA and USC are leaving, but it's going to be a really fun conference. Definitely go check those out. They'll be up on UteZone soon. If not there, everything's on my Twitter account. You can see that right there. And I've got like 9 or 10 of those articles out right now. I think Utah is going to be the next one, or USC is the next one, actually. Utah's the day after that. So a lot of stuff there, but it's going to be a good, really, really competitive conference this year. I think that Utah, Oregon, and USC are kind of a head above Oregon State and Washington are, whereas a lot of other people are trying to make this out to be a 5-horse race. I think it's more of a 3-horse race, but I mean, those 3 teams are all extremely talented and extremely well. We're going to be extremely well prepared to dominate this season.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun season as always. Dante, appreciate you joining us.
No problem. Thank you, JT.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Utes, but we'll be back with you tomorrow on another edition of Locked On Utes, talking all things Utah football.